Hello and welcome to IO Codes. In this video, I'll be showing you how to integrate JWTs with Spring Security in order for you to properly secure your application, taking into consideration two terms in security known as authentication and authorization. So all you have to pretty much do is provide the necessary configuration in order for you to properly secure that application of yours. And that is what I'll be showing you in this video. Now, the prerequisite for following alongside this video tutorial is that you need to have a proper understanding of Spring Boot or how to create simple Spring Boot application that just exposes your CRUD endpoint. Okay, if you don't really know how to get started with that, I have a complete Spring Boot tutorial on a book project where I've shown you the step-by-step procedures on how to set up your application, secure your application, test your application, and even deploy your application. So you can get started with that video. I'll be providing you the link to that video in the description of this video below. So all you have to do is scroll down to the description section and click on that video, so you know how to get started with a Spring Boot application or to create a Spring Boot application. Now, enough of those stated. This is how you code, and if you are coming across this channel for the first time, please do subscribe to this channel, give this video a thumbs up, as well as ping that bell icon so that whenever I upload the next video, you will get notified. Now, like I stated, the approach that I've taken for this video is that I've created a GitHub repository for the video, and I'll move over to the repository now. So I'll open my browser, and here we have it. Okay, so this is the IO Code JWT Spring Security project, basically the project I'm talking about now. We have two branches. So right here, this is the start branch, which is basically the begin phase of the application. So I just made a template application that exposes a CRUD endpoint for a particular entity that has been defined in the application. So I'll open source, and right here in main, I want to see the application that we have defined, or the endpoints that we have defined. So the entity that I've defined for this application is a student entity, and basically we are going to look at the content of this student entity. So we just have the details of the student, and then we are using Spring Data REST to create repository endpoint or perhaps CRUD endpoint for this student. So with Spring Data REST, it exposes that endpoint to it exposes the different endpoints that the entity should have. Okay, so that is just the basic term to use for it. So what you want to do now is clone this start repository, clone the start branch of this repository. So I'll move back to my main repository, and back here we want to take a look at the readme. So you just have to copy the whole of this inside of the directory you want to start this project. Then you clone the start branch. You can see git clone single branch start, then the link to this particular repository. So that is basically all you have to do. Now we'll get to a point in this video where you need to include the whole of this dependency inside of the pom.xml file. So when we get to that point, all you just still have to do is just copy the whole of these and paste it inside of your pom.xml file, then you resolve. I'll be doing all of those in a jiffy from now, so please stay till the end of this video so you get a proper understanding on how to secure your Spring Boot application whilst integrating JWT alongside with it. So now, after you've successfully cloned your application, you can open with any code editor of your choice. Right now I'm making use of IntelliJ, and that is okay by me. You can make use of VS Code or Eclipse. So now we have the main class on the screen. So what I want to pretty much show you is the content we have inside of our pom.xml file. Take note that this is just a template that I'll be using for carrying out this security concept. Okay, so right inside of our pom.xml file, I want us to take a look at the different dependencies that have been defined. First of all, we have JPA, Spring Data JPA, basically for carrying out concept relating to database, actions relating to database, and we have Spring Data REST. Okay, is basically what exposes entity endpoint. Then we have the starter web for web applications, and we also have Lombok for reducing boilerplate code, as well as our in-memory H2 database. So I'm making use of H2 database because we are not persisting any data. Basically it's just a tutorial video, so we can make use of H2 database. But in a real world scenario where you want to deploy your application and let user have access to the application, you have to make use of DBMS such as PostgreSQL. So you provide a dependency for the respective DBMS you want to make use of. Now for our book project, the video tutorial I did some weeks back, we made use of Postgres. Okay, so if you have seen that video, you know that we basically persisted the data after starting or ending of the application. So that's basically it. So now there's one more dependency that is missing out from this list that we've defined here, and that dependency is the Spring Security dependency. So basically talking about Spring Security, but we don't yet have that dependency in this defined student application template. So I'll have to include that dependency to make things a little bit more faster. I'll copy the whole of this, Ctrl C, and I want to paste it directly below underneath. So we have the Springboot starter security in our scenario. So I'll just change that web to security, and that's basically it. Now all I have to do now is resolve this newly added dependency. So click on this icon, or if you are making use of Eclipse, all you have to do is right click, and I think you have an option to reload your project from Maven, just like I have it here, just like I have it right here. Okay, that's a tongue twister in a way. So right now I have successfully resolved the dependency. So now I'll start the application and see the default configuration that Springboot will provide for us. So I've started the application. Now just before the application builds up successfully, let us take a look at our applications.properties file. So if I'm to open the application.properties file, I've defined a list of configuration for my database, or perhaps my data source. I've specified a URL to an in-memory database of H2, and I also made use of the H2 driver. And for the password and the username, we can leave it as null. Okay, now back to our run log. Let us take a look at what is happening here. It's still running, so just give it some time. It should be done in a jiffy from now. So right now the application has started, and we can see a log that says using generated security password, and this should also be printed out in your machine if you are following my steps. So what I want to do now is just copy the whole of this password, Ctrl C, and we can as well take a look at the log underneath. There's this extra log that says this generated password is for development use alone, and I believe you know that as well. So this is basically for development phase, and even as we are developing, you are changing this or to configuration that Spring Boot has provided us with. Okay, we want to provide our own implementation for the type of password we'll be making use of inside of our application. Now for me to call the different endpoints, or perhaps the endpoints that is being exposed by Spring Data REST from our application, I'll have to use a tool known as Postman. Now if you don't really know what Postman is, I have a detailed video on how to set it up and what it really entails. Okay, I'll be providing a link to that video in the description section of this video. So all you have to do is scroll down to the description section and copy, or perhaps click on the link to redirect you to that particular video. And when you are done watching that video, you can get back to this one. So right here in Postman, I pretty much already defined the student endpoint that it exposed, but I'm going to remove the whole of this, the student part. Then I'll send a request to our server. So now that we have Spring Security inside of our dependency, inside of our pom.xml file, sending a request has been blocked, okay, because I failed to provide the necessary credentials for authorization or for authentication. So the response I'm getting back is a 4.1 unauthorized. Now for me to fix that issue, right here in Postman, I have to click on the authorization tab, And instead of no auth that we have here, I'll have to change to basic authentication, and I'll provide the username as user. That is the default that Spring Boot wants from us. Now inside of this password field, I think I've used a previously generated UUID, but in my scenario I want to use the recent generated. Okay, so I'll just paste it right here and then I'll send. So we have a 200 OK this time around, and we have the links or the endpoint that is being defined by Spring Data REST. So we'll be visiting this endpoint one more time. Now we have the student endpoint. So back to our authorization tab, I want to change to basic auth again, and we have the credentials. Then I'll send in this request. So now we see that we have the list of students being returned back. For now, we don't really have any students inside of our database. So basically, it's just empty. So I want to show you the workflow of how Spring Security secures this application for us and how it works when a user tries to access a protected resources. So right here on our screen, we have the Spring Security workflow. At first, we have a request, and when that request is being sent to the server, because we have the Spring Security dependency, it's been intercepted by what is known as an authentication filter. Now in most scenarios, at first it checks what is known as the security context to see if an authenticated user has been associated with that particular thread of request, okay, or thread of commands, okay. And if the user is already inside of the security context and the session is still valid, it pretty much skips this whole authentication logic. However, if no user is present inside of our security context, this is the flow that it follows. So the authentication filter delegates that request to the authentication manager, and then the authentication manager delegates the request again to the authentication provider. Now in our case, the authentication provider is going to make use of an interface known as the user details service. So we are going to be providing implementation for the user details service inside of this project or inside of this tutorial section. So the user details service will be used to search for that particular user from any of the source you are to search from, or from any of the sources to search from. In our case, it's going to be our in-memory database, okay. And then it takes the password that is associated with that request, encodes the password, and check to see if the password of the returned user is equal to the encoded password of the raw form password string that have been passed in as request. And if it happens that this user is valid, after checking the password, the encoded password, it returns back to the authentication provider, which returns back to the authentication manager, then back to the filter, and that user is stored inside of the security context and is being associated with the thread of request. Okay, so this is basically the simplest illustration I can give at the moment. If there's something you didn't clearly understand, just ask your question in the comment section and I'll be very happy to respond to them. So this is basically the flow that Spring Security follows. So we just took a look at the Spring Security workflow, but we are going to be making use of JWT tokens alongside with Spring Security. So let us take a look at what a JWT is. So JWT stands for JSON Web Tokens, and right here from the official endpoint or website of the JWT, it says the JWT is an open source standard RFC 7519 that defines a compact and self-contained way for securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object. So basically the informations are being sent in JSON format, and because it's a token implementation and it is used over the web, it is known as JSON Web Tokens, or JWT for short. So let us see what JWT structure looks like. It's in its compact form. JSON Web Token consists of three parts that are separated by dots, and these three parts are the header, the payload, and the signature. So basically a representation of it is going to be like this. the x dot, the y dot, the z. And we are going to break it down, and we can say the header typically consists of two parts: the type of the token, which in our scenario, or which in this case is a JWT token, and the signing algorithm that was used to generate that token, or that was used to sign that token. So we have the algorithm HS256, which simply stands for HMark SHA-256, and we can also have ROSC in some scenario. And then we have the type of token JWT, JSON Web Token. Now you see, then this JSON is base 64 URL encoded to form the first part of the token. So just like we saw x.y.z, so this basically is going to be like the x part of the token. And then we have the payload, which I often call the body at times, and I said it's the second part of the token, which contains the claims. Now claims are statements about an entity, which typically is the user. So one statement about an entity that we can see or that we will be using in this application is the username or the email of our user. So definitely we are going to be creating a user for our application, because it's the user that would be accessing the application. And then it says an additional data. So there are three types of claims: registered, public, and private claim. So we'll be focused more on the registered claims. Okay, these are sets of predefined claims which are not mandatory but recommended to provide a set of useful interoperable claim. Some of these are issuer, expiration date, subject, and audiences. So let us just skip the public claims and let us take a look at the signature. It says to create the signature part. Then again, before the signature part, this part, which is the payload, is also base 64 URL encoded. So please take note of that to form the second part of the JWT token. Now back to the signature. It says to create the signature part, you have to take the encoded header, the encoded payload, a secret which will be generating, the algorithm specified in the header, and then we sign that. Okay, so we are going to sign the whole of this in a moment from now, when we start generating our token and seeing the implementation of this. Say, for example, if you want to use the HMark, that's the HS256 algorithm, the signature will be created in the following way. It will be created with the whole of this, okay, and then we'll be using a sign key, a private key, to sign it. Okay, the signature is used to verify that the message wasn't changed along the way. And in the case of the token signed with a private key, it can also verify that the sender of the JWT is who it says it is. Okay, now when we put all of this together, we form the JWT token. So the output is 3 base 64 URL strings separated by dots that can be easily parsed in HTML and HTTP environment. Now if you want to read more, get much more understanding on what this JWT is, you can just simply visit this website, jwt.io/introduction. I'm going to take out the introduction part and then click on enter. And right here we have the JWT decoder website. Okay, now we have the encoded form of this JWT, and we also have the decoded format. Okay, the decoded form. So we have the header, which is basically this part. Now if I'm to change something from this header and change to ROT, we discover that we have an error because the JWT is now invalid, because we now have an invalid signature. Now to correct that, I'll have to undo what I just pretty much changed. So that is basically it. Immediately the token is changed or the token is tampered with, it becomes invalid, and whosoever try to tamper with the token become useless to that person. Per se, in let's use as an example an attacker. So if the attacker tries to tamper with the token, the request becomes invalid because it can no longer validate the token, because its signature automatically is going to change. So if I'm to make changes here, you see the value of the signature basically changes. Okay, so that is just basically it. Now so we just have to move back to IntelliJ And the very first thing we are going to be doing is creating a user for our application. So with that explanation, I believe we now understand how JWTs work, or what JWTs are. And in addition to that, we also saw how Spring Security secures our application with the default configuration that Spring Boot provides us with. Now we are going to start implementing these features in our application. At first, inside of our entity class, we are going to create a new user that will be used to send requests. So that user is basically who sends requests to our application. So that should be an auth insert, and we want to create this Java class I'll call user. Now in addition to this class, we'll be creating the repository of this particular user. So that should be user repository, and it simply extends CRUD repository. And we're going to pass in the parameterized value, which is user, or the type. And in the case of our user, we are going to make use of the string as the ID, which will happen to be a UID generated string. That is a UUID generated string. So passing a string. Now I want to annotate this class with @resource or repository rest resource. Oops, my bad. And we want to change the expected value to false. So the reason for this is because changing the expected value to false will ensure that Spring Data REST does not provide endpoints that exposes our user. Okay, so that is the reason why we are changing the expected value of this particular annotation to false. Now in addition to all of this, we want to create one more feed or one more file, which is an enum file, and that file is pretty much called role, that represents the roles of a user. And right here I'll have to click on enum, and this enum is going to define just two values. One of them should be admin and the other should be user. So you can go ahead, add values to your role. Can be a super admin, you can add super user, just depend on the specifications of your application. So let's take for example a marketplace application or an e-commerce application. So we have two different users of this application. First of all, we have the seller and we also have the customer. So you can go ahead, create roles for that application that simply takes in customer or seller as roles, and you can also as well add admin in that same application. So it just depends on what you choose for your application, what suits properly for the application you are developing. So back to our user class, we are going to start defining the respective fields, but then the user that Spring Security makes use of for the authentication process or the authentication logic of a Spring Boot application implement an interface known as the user details interface. But before we implement this interface in this particular application, we are going to be defining the respective fields that is required for the user. So at first, I'm going to define the ID, that should be private string, like I've stated, UID, and a semicolon, and I'll have to annotate this particular field with an ID and also annotate with a generated value. I want to set the strategy generation type dot UUID. Okay, so that is basically it. And the next field we are going to define should be the username of this particular user. So that should be private string username. And I just have to copy the whole of this stand, Control D, 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 D. And the next should be the password, followed by the first name and the last name. And basically, I think we are good to go. I would have said email, but email and username pretty much does the same thing in our scenario. Okay, now we have to provide the respective annotation: getter, setter, builder, as well as the table. Now when I move back to my student class, these annotations are here already, so I just have to copy them all, and back to my user class I just paste them just to make everything a little bit faster. And in addition to these annotations, I need two more annotations. One of them is at builder, and the other one should be at table. So I'll be able to provide my own configuration for the table that Hibernate automatically creates for us. So I think the name of my table should be underscore users. There's a reason for this. So that is basically it. Now we need to implement our user details service. Sorry, our user details. But before we implement our user details, we discover that we don't really have a feed of roles for our user. So that should be a private list and takes in role and say roles. And yeah, I'll have to import the list class. So this is basically everything that our user pretty much needs. Now we need to implement the user details. So that should be an implement user details. Next thing for us to do now is provide implementation for the different method that this particular interface defines. So just click on implement methods, and right here just hold shift and click on is enabled to copy the whole of this or to highlight the whole of the different functions, and then you click on OK. Okay, so right now we have a couple of methods. Is account non-expired, is account non-locked, is account is credentials not non-expired, and is enabled. I want all the values that would be returned in each of this method call to be true. So at first I'm going to highlight all of this till this period, then I'll just use Alt-J to select everything that has the same values, then Control Shift and forward Control key to highlight everything. Then I'll change the value to true. So that is basically it. So now the return value of all of this function is true. Now if any of this is to return a false value, then our user will not be able to access the application. So we want to ensure that the return value is true. Okay, now the next thing is to return a list of granted authorities. So we have the roles, and the values in these roles will be used to create a new simple granted authorities, and we pass that authorities as list. So in real world applications, a particular user with the privilege or the authority of an admin can also have the role or the authority of user. Okay, so in real world application, a particular user can have authorities ranging from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. So we can have an e-commerce application whereby a seller can also be a customer in the same application. So just take note of that, and that is why we have the list of rows, not just a single row but a list of rows. And now we'll be looping through the rows and creating a new simple granted authorities and passing it to a collection or adding it to a collection, and we return that collection right here. So just watch closely. At first I'm going to define the simple granted collection, so that should be set simple granted authority. Oops, my bad. And we have authorities is equal to new hash set, and I have to import. That is it. So right here we say rows dot for each. Okay, for each role we're going to create a new, sorry, not create, but call authorities dot add, then new simple granted authority, and say role dot name. Okay, so it gives us the string value of this particular enum type, and we want to return a value of the authorities. So that is basically it. Now, because this value is an enum type, we want to annotate with at enumerated, and the field we want to pass in is the value. That should be enum type dot string. So it makes use of the name of the role and not an integer value or perhaps a number. Okay, so if I'm to change to ordinal, it means that the values in this particular row definition will be used. So right here we have 1 and the second one should be 2, or perhaps 0 and 1. So this is 0 and this is 1. So if I'm to change to ordinal, it takes in the position value, which happens to be 0 and 1 in this scenario. But using the value of enum type.string, it's going to store these values in the string format inside of the database. So we've pretty much defined everything that is required for a user in our application. So the next thing we want to take a look at is how to start implementing JWT, that is by creating a JWT service class as well as creating a JWT authentication filter class. Now, in order for us to get started with the creation of our JWT service class, we need to include the JWT dependencies inside of our pom.xml file. So right here inside of the pom.xml file, when we take a close look at what we have here, we are yet to include the dependency for the JWT classes. So we'll move back to our GitHub repository. So that is pretty much where I'll be getting the JSON web token dependency from. So I'll just copy this. You should as well do the same thing, and then move back to your pom.xml file, and you can paste it anywhere, any place of your choice. Okay, so I'll paste it directly under the h2 database dependency, and now all I have to do now is resolve this dependency. So while the resolving of the dependency is going on, we have to create our JWT service class. So I'll create a new class. In that class, I'll place it inside of a package I'll call service. Now it should be service.jwt service. And at first, I'll be annotating with at service so that Spring creates an instance of this class during the startup. That is a bean of the class. So recall that during the creation of a JWT token, we need a couple of variables or a couple of components, and one of such components is the secret. So this secret is what we use to generate the key, okay? And then another component that we'll be needing is the claims or perhaps the subject. So we'll see how to define all of this right now. So at first, we'll be creating a secret. So that should be a private string secret. And this secret, I want us to inject it directly from our application.properties file. So I'll have to annotate with our value and passing a string jwt.secret to import. Now for us to generate this secret, we'll be making use of git bash. So this secret string can be in an hexadecimal form, so we'll be generating it with the use of git bash. Okay, so right here I'll open up git bash. I think I already have it open, and you can see I already generated this key previously prior to this moment. You use the command open ssl ran-x and then 32. Okay, so you just have to click on the string, copy the whole of the string, and back inside of our application on properties file, take note of this jwt.secret, and you move back there and you see jwt.secret equals to the hexadecimal secret string. So that is pretty much it. So back to our jwt.service class, we need to generate a key with this particular secret. Okay, in order for us to generate this key, we are going to create a method for it. So that should be private, and we can see it returns a key, and we can say generate signing key, And let me import the class. It's directly from java.security. And what we want to return is keys dot hmec. Then we decode this particular secret, which should be decoders dot b64 dot decode. Okay, then we pass in our secret string. So that is basically it. So it's going to generate this, it's going to create this key for us. And the next item on our list is the generation of our JWT token. So we'll be creating a public method for that. So this should be public. Our JWT token, as we all know, it is a string. So that should be string. It returns a string, and we can say generate JWT token. So in some scenario, if you have a couple of claims that you want to pass in, you use this particular parameter as the argument or as the variable. So you can see map of string and object. Okay, but in my scenario, then you specify the names as claims. But in this scenario, what we basically need is the username. So in order for us to make things a little bit simple, we can continue with our implementation. We just have to pass in a string, and that string should be the username of that particular user. Okay, and now I want to return the following: jwts dot builder dot compact. And in between builder and compact, we have to set a couple of other fields. At first, we'll be setting the subject, and we're passing the username as the subject. And the next thing is to set the issue date, which is the time this particular JWT was issued. And we can say new date. I'll have to import that. And system dot current time millis. Okay, now the next thing is to set the expiration date, which should simply also be new date. And we have system dot current time millis plus 8000 times 24. Okay, and we have to sign with the key, which should be generate signing key, and our algorithm, which is signature algorithm dot hs256. Okay, and that is basically it. So with this, we have successfully created a method that generates our JWT token. So I'll just love to walk you through the steps that generates this token. Okay, at first we need our secret, and our secret can be an hexadecimal string. Okay, and then we have to ensure that it's an hexadecimal string. Okay, but there are also other formats you can use, a byte. Then we have to decode this string using base64 to create a key. So this is the function or the method call we use in creating the key. Now the next thing is to generate our token. To generate our token, we use the jwts.builder, and while building, we set the subject, we set the issue date, and we also set the expiration time as well as the sign width. Then we provide our key followed by the particular signature algorithm that was used in signing the key or creating the key. Then we call the compact function to create a string representation of our JWT token. So now we've created the method for generating our JWT token. The next method we want to take a look at is the method that extract the different claims that are inside of the JWT token. And remember that one of such claims is the subject, another is the expiration time. So these are basically two claims that we'll be making use of in other classes that we'll be looking at. Okay. Now, the reason for setting an expiration time for a JWT token is to ensure that the JWT token does not have a lifespan of, I'll pretty much say, forever. So we practically need to set the expiration time of the JWT token to ensure that this lifespan is between specified time. Okay. Now, for us to extract the claims from our JWT token, we have to create a new method, and that method should be public, and it returns an object of type claims. And we can say we'll have to import at first. We can call this function extract claims. So as you all know, it's extracting this claim from the JWT token. So we have to pass in the token as parameter to this particular function. So this should be a string, and we'll say JWT token. And right here, similar to what we have previously, we are going to return JWTs dot builder, not builder this time around, sorry, but Payzer builder dot set signing key, which is our generate signing key function or method, dot build dot paste claim JWS. Then we'll pass in our JWT token dot get body. And in addition to that, we can set the signature. Okay, I think okay, we can't set the signature, my bad. But then getting the body, we return all of the claims that are defined inside of the JWT token. So after we've extracted this token, after we've extracted the list of claims inside of the JWT token, what we can do is to get the values of each claim from the extract claims function. In order for us to do that, at first we'll be extracting the subject from the claims. So we are going to create a new function for it. Now our subject is the username and it's in a string form. So we are going to have public string, and this should be extract subject, and we'll pass in our token. I think I'm missing it. Typing has really become an hectic thing for me to do. So this should be extract claims. Then we'll pass in our JWT token again dot get subject. Okay, and we have to return this value. Now the next thing is to extract the expiration date. So I'll just have to copy the whole of this, and then I'll paste it right here. And the expiration time, the value it returns is the date. So instead of get subject, this time around we'll be getting expiration, and we have to call this extract expiration. And I think we are good to go for now. And finally, we have to check if a token is valid. Now to check if a token is valid, we want to check that the expiration date is still is after the date that the token is being used. Now, if the date that the token is being used is after the expiration date, it automatically makes the token invalid to access our application. So we have to create a new function for that, and that function returns a boolean value. So this should be public boolean is token valid, and we'll pass in our string JWT token, and we want to check that the new date before extract expiration. Then we'll pass in the JWT token, and then we just have to return this value. So that is it. So we want to ensure that the date we are trying to access the application with the JWT token is before the expiration date of the particular JWT token. So we've provided the necessary implementation and definition of the different function or method that this JWT service class should define. Now we'll take a look at how to create our JWT filter class. So now, before we create our JWT authentication filter class, I'd love to show you the image one more time for our Spring Security workflow. We have the authentication manager, authentication provider, a user details service, which happens to be an interface, and the password encoder. So for all of this, we have to define a bin for each of these different items. Okay, so in order for us to define bins inside of our application, we have to make use of a configuration class, and I'll be creating that configuration class, and then I'll move on to define the respective bins that we'll be needing for our authentication logic. Then we can move on to the creation of our authentication filter class. So back here, right in IntelliJ, I want to create a new config class. So I'll do an auth insert, a Java class. And since this class is a configuration class, I like to place it inside of a config package. And the name of my class should simply be app-config. And the very first thing for me to do is to annotate this class with configuration. And the next one should be at required as constructor. Okay, so the field that we want to inject is a final user repository. User repository. And that is it. Now, inside of our user repository interface, I want to define a single method or a single function that returns an optional user. And this function is called find by username. It takes in a string and we pass the string value as the username of that particular user. So back inside of our app config class, the first bin we want to define is the user details service bin. So I'll annotate this method with @bin, and we should have it as public user details service, then user details service. Enter. And right here we want to return a simple lambda expression. So or else, I think I should just place this in a new line. Or let's throw new username not found exception. I will simply say user not found. So that is basically it. And this should be a supplier and not just a direct object creation. So we need to also call in a lambda expression inside of our all-s-throw method call. So basically our user details service defines a single method, and since it defines a single method, which is the load user by username, we can pretty much provide the implementation for it, making use of a lambda expression. Okay, so that is it. Now the next bin we want to define is the password encoder bin. So that should be at bin again. Then we have the public password encoder. Then we have password encoder. And we simply want to return a new instance of the bcrypt password encoder. So this is it for our password encoder. Now the next bin should be our authentication provider. So we start with that bin again, then we'll go public authentication provider. I want to create a new instance of DAO authentication provider. So we are going to say DAO authentication provider DAO is equal to new DAO authentication provider, and we can pass in our password encoder as a parameter. So we're just passing password encoder and a semicolon. And now I want to set the user details of this particular DAO provider. But at first, let me collapse my file tree so you can get a proper view of everything I'm doing. So we go ahead and say DAO authentication provider does set user details service. Now we're also going to call the user details service bin that we've defined already. Then we'll pass it to this particular set details user service called. And the next is to return our DAO authentication provider. So right now we've defined 3 bins. Okay, we defined the user details service, the password encoder, as well as the authentication provider. Now the next bin that remains for us to define is the authentication manager. So we start again with that bin. We'll say public authentication manager. Oops, not provider, but manager. Then we go authentication manager, and it takes in an instance of authentication configuration, and I'll simply call this config, and what it simply returns is the config.get authentication manager. And yes, I think it throws an error. So I'll have to add that exception to the method signature. It throws an exception, not an error. Okay, basically we've defined the respective bins that are required. So now we have to move back to our file tree again, and then right here we want to create our filter class. So at the topmost package again, we create this class, and I'll place it inside of a package called filter. So this should be JWT auth filter. Okay, and so Spring generates an instance of this class for us during the start of the program. I'll annotate without component. I think where necessary, I might also need the required as constructor. And here we have to first of all inject an instance of the JWT service class. So this should be private final JWT service, JWT service. Okay. Now for a filter, we have to extend the generic filter interface, or we have to either implement the generic filter interface, or we can extend the once per request filter. And in our scenario, we'll be extending the once per request filter, and then we'll be providing implementation for the abstract method that particular class defines, which is the do filter internal. So I'll just simply say extend once per request filter. Now we have to provide the implementation for the method. Okay, and now we can see that we have a couple of errors that are being indicated right here. So I'll do Alt G, and I think I'll enter. enter again. Oops, push this a little bit backward, and right here I want to separate in a new line. Okay, so what this expects from us in order for this stuff or this error to be gone is that we have to annotate without null. Okay, so that's basically what I'll just do. So right here I'll just start at null, then I'll just have to copy, Ctrl C, V space, V and space. So as you can see, that error is gone. Right now, the very first thing that is needed of us is to get to the security context and the authorization token. So for that, I'll be doing security context is okay, is equal to security context holder dot get context. I'll have to import this one, and then we can say string JWT token is equal to request dot get header, and right in the header we are going to pass the type of header which we'll expect, which happens to be an authorization header. Okay, so there's something I'd like to let you know. When an header token is being sent, it's sent in as a bearer token, and it's always been preceded by the word bearer. So we'll have to extract that string out of the JWT token. In order for us to do that, we'll have to say JWT token is equal to, before that, we are going to check if the JWT token is null and if the context does not contain any authentication, or if the context does not contain any authenticated entity. So we are going to say if JWT token equals to null, or context dot get authentication is not equal to null, then basically want to pass our request and response to the next filter chain. So we say filter chain, okay, request and response, and before the whole of this we have to say .do filter, and then we return from the method. However, if the JWT token is not null, so we are going to say JWT token is equal to JWT token dot substring. Then we pass in the value, because the length of bearer is basically 6, but there is a space between the bearer and the token, so we have a length of 7 altogether. So we are going to start from index 7 to extract our read JWT token from the string from the authorization header that we will be getting from Postman. Now the next thing now is to extract the details of the username or the subject from the JWT token. So we are going to say string username is equal to JWT service dot extract subject, and we'll pass in our JWT token and a semicolon. Now if the username is not equals to null, we should carry out the following action. First of all, we want to search for our user with the use of the user details service. Okay, in order for us to achieve that, I'll have to inject an instance of the user details service right here. So that should be private final user details service and user details service. So I think I don't need one of the import statements. A couple of the import statements, I'm going to just delete them. Okay, 1, 2, and I think that is okay for now. So back here, I'm going to get an instance of our user. So user is equal to user details service dot load user by username, and we'll pass in our username, and we have to typecast to an instance of our own defined user. Now we have to create an auth token, so we'll go ahead and say var auth token is equal to new username password authentication token. Then we pass in our object principal, then the next should be the credential, which is null, and finally we have to pass in the authorities of our user. So we are going to say user.get authorities. Okay, and we end with a semicolon. The next thing is to set the details of this auth token. So I'm going to say auth token dot set details, and we're going to pass an instance of new web authentication details source dot build details. Then we'll pass in our request object, and now finally we have to use our context to save this authenticated entity. Context dot set authentication, we're going to pass in our auth token, and that is it. But before we carry out any of this logic, we want to ensure that our JWT token is valid. So inside of the if username is not null, we include the and JWT service dot is token valid. And passing our JWT token. This practically ensures that the user gets authenticated only when the JWT token is valid. Okay, now with all of those stated, we'll have to ensure that we delegate the request to the next filter in the chain of commands. So we also have to call our filter chain dot do filter, then we'll pass in our request and our response object. So with the procedures that I have taken right now, when you take a close look, at first we check to see that the security context does not contain any authenticated entity. Okay, as we are saying, context.get authentication is not equal to null. If context.get authentication is not equal to null, that is if there is something inside of the context already, there is an authenticated entity, then just pass the request to the next filter in the chain of command, or if the JWT token is equal to null, do exactly the same thing and then return from this method. Okay, there is no need to go ahead and execute the other logic. So now we are basically done with the JWT authentication filter class. So what we'll have to do now is to create our user service class as well as our user controller class. So before we go ahead and create our user service class or our user controller class, the first thing we want to do is to create a DTO, that is a data transfer object, for authentication and for registration of a new user. So right here I'm going to do DTO dot what I will call auth user, and the next should be auth insert reg user. Simply stands for register user, and the other stands for authenticate user. So basically, for register user, we are going to move back to our user class and copy the necessary fields. And these are the fields that we have to copy: username, password, first name, as well as the last name. Control C, and then right here inside of the register user, I'm going to paste all of those fields. And in addition to that, back inside of our user class, I'm going to copy some of the annotations that we have at the top. So that should be a Control C as well. And then back here, I'm going to paste the whole of this right here. And okay, I'll have to do away with the entity, and I think I'm good to go. Now for our auth user class, I'll have to copy the username and the password, because that is basically what we need for the authentication of a user. So I'm going to open this class now, and then I'll paste it right here. And again, I think I'll also have to just copy the whole of this, Control C, and paste it at the top of the class. So this is basically our DTO for authenticating a user and for registering a user. Now we have to go ahead and create our service class. So this is the service class that will be used for carrying out authentication and registration details. So right here, I'm going to create the service class, and I'll paste it inside of our service package. So that should be service. I already have that user service. Okay, and now, as we all know, we'll have to annotate with that service, and it's going to define two functions. Okay, now these two functions include the registration function as well as the authentication function. So firstly, we want to create this public function. Public, it returns a user instance in the case of a registration, which is public user register, and it takes in auth insert. It takes in an instance of reg user, and returns an instance of a new user. Okay, let me just put it at first like this so that we don't have any error. I'm going to change this implementation in a jiffy. So what we want to do is to inject a couple of beans, and the first bean we want to inject is the password encoder. So in order to inject the password encoder, we also have to annotate the class with @required ask constructor, and then we're going to provide a private final password encoder, and then we also have to provide a private final JWT service. Okay, I'll be including other beans as we progress through the development or the implementations of these different functions. So first of all, we are not saving a reg user directly to the database. We are going to save a user to the database, and that would be the user that will be returned. So we have to map this reg user to an instance of type user. So I'm going to create a private method for that. So that should be a private. It returns a user, and we're going to say map to what user, and it takes in a reg user instance. Okay, and right here we're going to return user.builder.build, and in between the builder and the build, we're going to set the necessary details, starting with the username. So that should be reg user.get username, followed by the f name, which is the first name. So that should be reg user.get first name, followed by the last name, reg user dot get I think last name, and then finally we basically have to set the password. Reg user dot set password, and then we are good to go. So right here, at first we are going to create this user is equal to map to user, then we'll pass in our reg user instance. Okay, so we are directly mapping to a user. Now before we save our user to the database, we have to encode the password. So definitely, okay, sorry, not set password, but this time around get password. So I think an error came up from that mistake. So now we are going to set the encoded password of our user. So that should be user.set password. Or we can as well just do it directly from here. So inside of our password, we have to wrap this inside of parentheses and then make use of our password encoder to encode the password from our reg user. And now all we just have to do is map to user, and then the next thing would be to return an instance of user repository dot save user. Okay, so this is definitely going to return our user back. So this is all we need for the creation of a user. Okay, now the next thing now is to authenticate our user. In order for us to authenticate our user, we also need the authentication manager. So that should be private final that A should be in caps, authentication manager, and say authentication manager. Then we need one more field. I think I'll figure that out. And now we have to define our authentication function. So this should be a public, returns a string, which is our JWT token, authenticate, which I'll just simply call auth, and it takes in an instance of auth user. I'll just say auth user. Then I'll have to import this class as well. Okay, anytime the prompt comes up, I'm going to do that, so I'll have to import. So now we are just going to return null at first. So our user contains a username, so we are going to find our user from the user detail service, making use of the user detail service. So that is pretty much the variable I was thinking about to ingest. So that should be private final user details service, and we have user details service. Okay, so now we are going to say user is equal to a typecasted instance of user that is being returned by the user details service dot load by username, and then we are going to pass our username from our auth user instance. So that should be auth user dot get username. Now to wrap everything so that you see them clearly, I'm going to do that now. So everything that exceeds a particular line wraps to the next line, and let me just or perhaps close my file tree. So that's basically it, so you can get to see everything clearly. So now we can go ahead with the next implementation. So now with the use of the authentication manager, we have to authenticate this user. So that should be auth manager.authenticate, and we're going to pass in an instance of new username password authentication token. And the first thing we have to pass is the username. So this should be auth user, okay, dot get username followed by auth user dot get password, and we have to include our semicolon, and the next thing is to return an instance of our JWT service.generate token. So that should be return JWT service.generate JWT token, and then we have to pass in our username, which simply is authUser.get username. Okay, so that is basically it. Now we are done with the implementation of our register and our authentication logic. So what next now is to create our user controller class. So I'll open back my file tree, and my topmost package, I want to create this new class I'll place inside of the controller package. So that should be a controller dot user controller. Okay, just like we've defined two different methods inside of our user service class that are public, we'll be doing the same right here for our user controller. And to make this a REST controller, I'll have to annotate with that REST controller, and to ensure that we are able to access this particular controller with the path from our application or from our client, we have to also annotate with our request mapping. Okay, so that is it. Now we define these two different functions, and I'll have to inject an instance of the user service class, and then an auth enter. Right here I'm going to do required ask constructor. So the first should be a post mapping, and we have a public response entity user. I just have to call this function register, and it takes in the reg details from the body. So that should be at request body. We have the reg user, and what we want to return is response entity dot response entity dot of user service dot register a reg user instance. So that is for the registration. So what I have to do now is just copy the whole of this, Ctrl C, and paste it below this one, and let me include a space, and this time around we are returning a string. Let me close this out. So we are returning a string. So this function should be called authenticate, and instead of a response entity of type user, we are going to return a response entity of type string. We are getting an auth user. So I just highlight the whole of the reg user that I found here. So this should be auth user. I think I'll highlight this ones as well. Auth user, and instead of register right here, we are going to call it auth, and same thing with this one. Oops, my bad. Okay, I have to undo some stuff. Okay, these are the ones I necessarily have to make changes to. So this should be auth user, and right here from reg user I'll have to highlight I'm going to pass auth user, import the auth user instance, and we are going to authenticate and not register. So the error is gone and I think we are good to go. So post mapping to /register and a post mapping to /authenticate, which is simply auth for short. So now we are basically done with all of the implementations that has to do with creation of the token, registration of a user, as well as authentication of a user. Now what remains is how we override the default configuration that Spring Security provides us with, or perhaps that Spring Boot auto-configures Spring Security to provide us with. Till this moment, if I'm to run the application, we'll still be making use of basic authentication because we are yet to provide our own configuration. And in order for us to do that, since we are talking about configuration, we have to define a new class inside of our config package. Okay, so right here inside of the config package, I'm going to define an instance of security config. So that should be an auth insert and a Java class, and this should simply be called security config. And to make it a configuration class, at first we just simply have to annotate with that configuration, and this configuration class is just going to define a single bean for us. Okay, and I think we'll be injecting a couple of beans to this particular class, so I need the required args constructor. And now the bean that it defines is the security filter chain bean, so I'll have to annotate this function or the method with that bean, and we go ahead to say public security filter chain, and security filter chain takes in an instance of HTTP security and returns an instance of http.build. I think I'll have to include the return statement behind and also import the relevant classes. And it also throws an exception as well, so I'll have to include that to the method signature. Now to wrap this up, or Ctrl+1, okay, and let me just close the file tree so you get to see everything clearly. So this is where we provide the configuration that overrides the default Spring Boot behavior. Now we also have to annotate with that enable web security. Okay, so a couple of beans that we have to inject at first is the private final authentication provider. Oops, I'll have to go back to my security config class. So that should be authentication provider followed by private final JWT auth filter. Now if there is any other bean we will have to inject, I'll be doing that as we provide configuration for our security filter chain as we implement the method. So at first we want to turn off CSRF as well as cause, though it's not really necessary in this scenario. So we'll have to say http.csrf, and it takes in an instance, we can make use of a lambda expression to just disable, or we can use the abstract HTTP configurer, which is ABS. Disable. So I think I'll just go with this option. .cause is not really advisable in an application. You have to provide your own cause configuration for it. So I think I just want to include that, though it's not really necessary, but I just want to go ahead and include that. I'll still passing the same lambda expression call, which is the abstract HTTP configurer : disable. Now the next thing we want to do now is to authorize the HTTP request. So we are going to take in an instance of HTTP, sorry, not add filter before, but authorize HTTP request. So we want to say HTTP request, and say HTTP request dot request matchers, and this is what we want to do. We want to wrap the whole of this inside of curly brace, so we can also provide other configuration for our HTTP request instance. So we have to pass in our registration endpoint, which is register, followed by our authentication endpoint, which is the auth dot permit all. Okay, now the next thing, we have to take hold of the HTTP request again, dot request matchers, and this time around we want to check our HTTP method dot post dot has any authority that is equal to admin. Okay, and I'll have to just click on enter to put it in a separate line, dot any request dot authenticated. And this is basically what it implies. It implies that any request that is coming to the register endpoint or the authentication endpoint of this application should be permitted. Then the next one states that any HTTP post request should be checked to ensure that the user, or perhaps the person requesting for that response, should have an authority of admin. Then all the other requests, such as the get method, should also be authenticated. Okay, that means a user with the privilege or the authority of user can be able to access other get method, other HTTP method. Okay, it can be pash or put. Okay, but I'm just using the HTTP method dot post as an illustration to ensure you get what the authorities of a user can do for the user. Okay, the authorization aspect of things. So this is basically how we configure the authorization aspect of things. Now the next thing is to include our session. So we say session management. I'm going to pass in session, and I say session dot session. Okay, oops, not that one, I just made an error. So this should simply be session creation policy. Then we have to pass in session creation policy dot stateless. And the next thing is to pass our authentication provider, which happens to be our DAO authentication provider. So this should be auth provider. And we want to simply add filter before. So this should be add filter before our JWT filter, before our username password authentication filter dot class. So what I want to simply do now is move this to the top before my auth provider, and then I'll include a semicolon. So with this, I think I've provided the necessary configuration that will override that of the default Spring Security behavior. Okay, now if there's anything I think I might have failed to include right here, maybe during the running of the application, I'll figure that out, then I'll come and add it right here. Okay, now since everything has been successfully developed, what we have to do now is run our application, and hopefully it works just the way we expect it to. So I'll run this application now, and then I'll open up Postman. I think I'll define user registration detail as well as the user authentication details. So right here, okay, before any further implementation, I think there's something I missed out on, and that is the creation or perhaps the mapping of our user registration details. So if I'm to go back to our user service class, you'll discover that I have failed to provide the roles for my user. Okay, so what I simply want to do now is right here, I'm going to set role dot roles. Okay, we set list dot off. So I'll say role, Ctrl Z, role dot user. I'll have to import that enum type. So this is it. Now I'll just have to start the application over again. So every user that is being registered in our application have a role of user. So basically, there is no user that will be able to send in a post request to other endpoints apart from the register endpoint and the authentication endpoint of this application. So after building, we are going to test these implementations. So during the building phase, let us take a look at Postman. And right here, I've defined a dummy data previously, and that should be hef name, l name. But I think in our scenario, if I'm to go to our user class or our user registration class, okay, the DTO, we are making use of first name and last name in full, not f name. So I'll have to change the whole of this. This is a dummy data I've used for a previous application. So that should be first name, and this should be last name. Okay, and I think we are good to go, and we'll be sending this request to the /register endpoint. So let me check to see if the build process has completed. Okay, it has started. So back to Postman, I'm going to send our request and let's see the response we'll get. So we have a 403 for bidding. Okay, I'd love to quickly take a look at what we have here. We have an exception that has been thrown, and I'd love to quickly check. Okay, we can see that we have an error converting Java object to enum, and I think this is in relation to the database we are making use of. I think H2 simply does not understand the enum type. So instead of making use of enum type, let us simply just make use of the string representation of this particular enum type. So back to our user class, I'm going to say string of, instead of rows, we need strings. And right here, I'm going to do away with this at enumerated annotation, and I'm also going to remove the dot name just to fix that issue. And I think inside of our user service class, we'll have to pass dot name. Okay, I think we are good to go. So role.user.name will get the name of this particular enum type and add it to our list of rows. Okay, so that is basically it. And one more thing I'll have to also include and do right now is inside of our app config, I'm going to implement the command line runner and also inject an instance of or perhaps just leave it as is, just implement the command line runner command line runner, and then I'll provide configuration for our run method or implementations for our run method. So this should be okay. And right here, I want to build a new user with the role of an admin. So we are going to differentiate between a user that will register directly from Postman and a user that has been saved inside of the application during the startup of the application. So this should simply be user is equal to user.builder dot build, and in between the builder and build, I want to set the respective details starting with the first name. So this should simply be IO code first name dot last name, which is IO code last name dot email, sorry, not email but username. Okay, that should be IO code at gmail.com, followed by the password. I think I'll have to encode this password, so basically I'll use the password encoder that has been defined. That should be password encoder.encode the string IO code. Finally, I'll have to set my role, so that should be list.off role dot admin dot name insert to say, followed by a comma and role dot user dot name as well. So basically you see that we have a list right here. We have two roles that has been given to our user inside of the application itself. So IO code at gmail.com or IO code has the roles of both an admin and a user at the same time. So this is what I was trying to say when I say a particular user can have more than a single role or a single authority. Okay, so now what I just have to do now is restart the application, and hopefully the exception that was thrown should be resolved, and then we test with a user that will be created directly from Postman, and we also are going to test with our IO code credentials. So I'll reload, and before it's built successfully, let me open up Postman to see if there are any relevant changes we have to make. So I think user registration details is okay, and now the user authentication details is pretty much what I believe I'll also have to change. So okay, I think we are good to go. The username and the password is okay, and for now we are going to at first test with terry@gmail.com. So right here, I want to just move back, copy the username and password of Terry, Ctrl C, and to our authentication details, before I test with the define user IO code, I'm going to paste the details of Terry here, and I just have to do away with this additional space. And let me check to see if the application has started. I think we are good to go now. So I'm going to send this registration request again to our server, and hopefully this time around we should get a 200 okay. Okay, now we get a 200 okay with the details of the user being sent back. And the next thing for us to do now, we can see that we have the authorities of this particular user as authority user. Okay, and the next thing for us to do now is to authenticate with this user credential. So I'll send the request again, and hopefully we are going to get the returned JWT token, and now we are also getting the JWT token with a 200 OK response. So I'll copy this token, Ctrl C, and to my get data, to get the list of students from the database, let's just load some time. We can see that I've already set the bearer token right here, but now we have a new generated JWT token, and I have to paste that token right inside of this box. So to change it, you have to move to the authorization tab, and from no auth, you have to make use of the bearer token. Okay, that is basically it. So the bearer token will automatically include Postman will automatically include the string bearer alongside a space before the JWT token. Okay, so that is why we have to extract the JWT token from what Postman will send as the authorization header to our server. So we have to extract that bearer statement as well as the space associated with it out from the value of the authorization header. Now I'll send a get request to my student endpoint, and we have a 403 forbidding. So I don't really know why. I'll have to check my log and see if there was an error, and I think yes, there was an error. Okay, it says JWT expired. Okay, difference of 47106 milliseconds, and I think I'll have to fix that. So I'll move back to my JWT service class, and I pretty much want to increase the lifespan of this particular token. So right here I'll have to multiply with 24 again. So hopefully this time around the JWT token has a longer lifespan. So I'll reload again, stop and rerun. And now we have a successful build one more time. And back to our postman, I'm going to send the request again to our registration endpoint. Recall that we are making use of an H2 database, so we have to do this every time because during the startup of the application, a new database is created and previous created database are dropped. Okay, and it's an in-memory database. Please take note of that. Then I'll send again to this endpoint. And yes, we've gotten the credentials sent back, and back to user authentication details. The post, I'll send a request this time around, and we have a new JWT token. So I'll copy the whole of this JWT token and to my get data endpoint, which happens to call the student endpoint. I'm going to delete this one and paste in my new token, and then I'll send. So this time around we got a 200 okay because I've simply increased the lifespan of my JWT token. But now when I move over to the post data endpoint, recall that this particular user that is making this request only has the role of a user and not the role of an admin, or perhaps not the role or the authority of an admin. So I'll paste my token once again in this box, and let us take a look at what we have in the body. So we have the details of the particular student that we are planning to register to our database or save to the database, and we've also set our authorization header. So what I want to do now is send this request, and we can see that we have a 403 forbidding. This is simply because the current authenticated user, which happens to be Terry, does not have the permission or the role, perhaps the authority, to carry out this particular post request. Okay, so we'll have to change our authentication details from Terry to iocode@gmail.com. The reason is because we've defined a dummy user right here inside of our app configuration class, and we've saved this particular user to have the role of both admin and the role of a user. So back to postman, I'm going to authenticate, and then we take the JWT token that will be generated and send a post request to our server. So I'll send, and oops, we have a 403 forbidding. Okay, let me take a close look. So right here in the authorization tab, I don't really have anything, but let me check to see if I have any error. Okay, okay. There's something I failed to do, and that was saving the IO code user directly to the database. So we are going to make use of our user repository dot save function or the save method. So we have to save our user to the database in order for us to be able to carry out the post request. So sorry for that. I think it just escaped me. I didn't really thought about it. I forgot. Now I'm going to reload the application, and I've already walked you through the process of using a user that does not have the admin role to send the post request. Now this time around, all we have to do is just save our user and then call the post endpoint with this user that has the necessary authority or the necessary role to carry out such logic. Okay, just give it some time. The building is going to just take a while. Okay, that started successfully. Now I'm going to authenticate again, so I'll send in this request and we should get the 200 okay this time around for sure. So I'm going to copy the whole of this, Control C, and back to our post data. I'll open up, delete the whole of this previous generated token, paste my new token, and then we want to take a look at the body. Then I'll send the request. So we have a 201 created for the request that has been sent by IO code. Okay, this is simply because IO code has the authority to send post requests to our application because it has the role of an admin. So that is basically it for the authorization aspect of this video. So we've seen clearly how to configure the authorization aspect of our application. So basically, let us take a look at our security filter chain bin one more time. Right here, you see that I went ahead and permitted all requests to the registration endpoint and to the authentication endpoint, and then we ensure that any post request that is coming to our server should come from a user that has an authority of admin. Now if I'm to change this to an authority of user, definitely all users of the application will be able to send in post requests to the application or to the server. Okay, because during the registration phase of a user, if I'm to open my user service class, you discover that I'm assigning a role of user to all registered users. So for us to restrict access, that is, we have to provide necessary configuration for authorization. Okay, so only user with specific roles will be able to carry out some specific logic. So with all of those stated, that brings us to the end of this video tutorial. Please, once again, if you are yet to subscribe to this channel, please do so. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and as well provide your thoughts in the comment section. If you have any question, do ask the question and I'll be so happy to respond to them. Okay, so with all of those stated, peace out, and until the next one, keep being your best self. Catch you.